Resident Evil 4 is a masterpiece. There, I said it. You do not need to watch a nearly hour-long video for me to tell you that, especially if you're even the slightest bit familiar with the gaming genre. Groundbreaking titles like The Last of Us, Gears of War, and even Grand Theft Auto 5 all have major elements that tie all the way back to the massive impact Resident Evil 4 had due to its mind-blowing innovations. Some of you may have even heard people label RE4 as the best video game of all time, and no, they are not being hyperbolic. I'm not even going to waste my time trying to convince any of you that Resident Evil 4 is a good game. Instead, this video is going to be more for me rather than you. I spent years since my cringy 2019 Let's Play thinking RE4 was the definition of overrated, but after playing it for a second, third, and fourth time, and collecting each of the few trophies that comes with it, this video is going to be dedicated to giving Resident Evil 4 the long overdue praise it deserves, as well as going over each of its core elements and how I feel about them. If Resident Evil 4 Remake releasing next year, what better time to do so? Sit down, grab a snack, and get comfortable as we discuss
Resident Evil 4.
With how much of a quality game Resident Evil 4 is, you would think that it must have had a pretty smooth development process. Well, that's not exactly the case. With a 6-year gap between RE3 and RE4 is anything to go by, Capcom had their hands full of this one. Development on the first of many builds of this game began in 1999 and was meant to release for Sony's new powerhouse at the time, the PlayStation 2. The main concept revolved around a new protagonist named Tony, and the mystery surrounding both his superhuman abilities, strong intellect, and invincibility. I don't know how you make a game about someone who's invincible, but what do I know? This crazy-ass change in style originated from RE2 director Hideki Kamiya wanting to always make a stylish action game, but after the series creator Shinji Mikami understandably felt it leaned too far away from Resident Evil, it was instead turned into its own thing which went on to become Devil May Cry. Development began once again in 2002 for another build that would feature returning main protagonist Leon S. Kennedy infiltrating an Umbrella castle in Europe. From the sounds of it, this build sounds like it would have been fucking awesome. Not only would it have continued the Europe subplot set up in RE2 and the RE3 epilogues, but it would also have featured returning familiar enemy types such as the zombies. Unfortunately, this build was also scrapped at 40% completion for presumably unknown reasons. That leads us to our third build, which is the most popular of the bunch due to it being shown at 2003's E3. This scrapped version of the game saw Leon being infected by a disease that made him see hallucinations, and in it, you would have to survive and fend off against paranormal type enemies, with one of these being a shadowy figure carrying around a hook dubbed by the fandom as the Hook Man. Unfortunately, this version of the game was just deemed too expensive to make at the time, and was scrapped along with the rest. After all these scrapped ideas, Shinji Mikami decided he'll just do it himself, and took over as director for Resident Evil 4. His first directorial role in an RE game since the very original. You would think that with Mikami now leading the project, things would go back to formula with fixed camera angles, pure survival horror, and familiar monsters. Well, if there's anything I've learned about Mikami, it's that he always wants to keep things fresh. And after playing the recently released Resident Evil 0, Mikami knew that the series had exhausted its old format, and decided to go in an entirely new direction of Resident Evil 4. From there, development was a smooth ride up until the game's release on January 11th, 2005. What I find most interesting about this development history is not just the cool concepts, but also how those concepts went on to influence aspects of the final game that we'll touch on later in the review. Let it be known that Resident Evil 4 is not only one of the few titles to survive developmental hell, but to actually be strengthened by it since it genuinely seems like it got better with each build taking inspiration from the last. So with all of that information laid out, the first thing that should become clear as we finally start talking about the actual game is the fact that RE4 is very different in terms of presentation than its predecessors. Gone are the days of pre-rendered environments oozing uneasy atmosphere along with cinematic fixed camera angles. Instead, we now have a third-person game with 3D environments built from the ground up. Now look guys, Code Veronica looked unreal for a Dreamcast game, RE Remake looked unreal for a Nintendo GameCube game, but RE4? Holy shit, it's in an entirely different league of its own. The graphics here aren't just stellar, they are revolutionary for 2005, with each environment you explore feeling very alive with the jaw-dropping levels of impressive detail on display here. You know it's crazy when I can take a 2005 Nintendo GameCube game and pass it off as an early PS3 title without question. They're that good and far ahead of their time, especially the models for both human characters and the monsters to face throughout your journey. It's not even just the graphics alone that I'm impressed with, but combine that with how big the game is, it blows my mind they were able to fit all of this onto a single disc. The soundtrack is also nothing to scoff at either. While RE4 doesn't have my favorite OST in the series, it certainly still delivers with tracks that range from moody, to heart-pumping, to assuring, like the saving theme, Serenity, which is amongst my favorite save themes in any Resident Evil game. And lastly, I just can't finish of how good the presentation is without also mentioning how interactable these environments are. From the stuff you can break, to checking out environmental information, to local wildlife, to secret passages you can activate, I cannot stress how the game really makes you feel as if you are in these areas. It's as if they took what was already immersive from the classics and repped it up times 10. What isn't returning from the classics, however, is the very way the game plays. One fun fact many RE fans don't actually know is that Shinji Mikami was not a fan of the tank controls and fixed camera angles in the original Resident Evil. Even though he was the creator of the game, he later admitted that the tank controls and camera angles fans love were actually a workaround and weren't part of his original vision. So you best bet that he came back with a vengeance for RE4, making it a third-person action horror game instead. Sorry, did I say third person? I meant third person over the shoulder. A uncommon, if not unheard of camera choice at the time. In the 2000s, most cameras were either locked at a first-person view, or were super dynamic with your character centered in the middle of the screen. RE4 instead has you following the action closer behind Leon, and when you aim, it will zoom in closer to give you a better view while aiming. I am not being hyperbolic when I say this camera model revolutionized the way third-person shooters operate. It's such a simple concept to us modern gamers. Have the camera take a backseat to get a proper image of our surroundings, but also have it zoom in when taking aim at enemies. But at the time, this simply wasn't thought of, and now practically every third-person shooter uses this exact same model because of its efficiency. In terms of controls, you can move around freely and aim in whatever direction you want to now. The inventory system from the past installments also make a comeback and is better than ever with more than enough available slots to carry loads of ammunition and weaponry, vital for this action-packed journey, as well as options that allow you to arrange and organize the many items to your heart's content to optimize space. Now, I think we've covered enough ground to get into the general gameplay Resident Evil 4 has to offer. If I haven't beat the message into you yet, this game has ditched a lot of the core elements that made Resident Evil, well, Resident Evil up to this point. Instead of a slow-paced, exploration-heavy survival horror journey, RE4 completely indulges in mindless, fast-paced action of horror elements. Instead of combat being a thing that should be avoided at every opportunity, it is the main bread and butter of this experience. There is much more of a heavy focus placed on large groups of enemies on screen along with incredible boss fights. Something this game does carry over is the high importance of conserving your resources and searching high and low for said resources. I know I said there's heavy combat in this game, but the ammo and health drops you receive are just enough for you to be able to fight against the large amount of enemies the game throws at you, while also rare enough to make every bullet count. This aspect alone is enough to make Resident Evil 4 still feel like Resident Evil despite its bold new direction. But how's the combat itself? If there's so much of it in the game, is that at least enjoyable? Absolutely. I plan on going into the specifics of the weapons and enemy types later on in the review, but for now, I'll keep things brief and simply state that this game features an impressively wide range of the aforementioned categories, that when combined together can lead to plenty of engaging encounters to keep things fresh throughout this 10-hour ride. Certain weapons work better in certain situations, some encounters can be completely randomized or have unpredictable elements, and there are usually so many different ways you can approach an encounter. You can play Resident Evil 4 10 times in a row and the combat will rarely feel repetitive, and that alone is an achievement. The health system has also been upgraded to fit the new action direction, since not only has the caution meter been replaced with an actual health bar, but can also take way more punishment than you could in previous games. Green herbs and red herbs make a return and can be combined to make an instant heal just like before, alongside first aid sprays. What is new are yellow herbs that can be combined with green and green-red mixtures that adds an extra bar to your HP upon healing. It's one of the many cool mechanics that allow you to get stronger the more you play. There's also extra heals you can find in the environment, such as eggs and fish that will give you a slight or sometimes even massive HP boost. Something people may definitely see as a downgrade is the fact this game is a much more linear experience than any Resident Evil game has been up to this point. That's because RE has primarily been about exploring one singular area with the goal of finding your way out of it, whereas in RE4, you're constantly moving from one place to the next with very few cases of actual backtracking. My stance on this is pretty simple, but if this was an exploration-heavy survival horror game, the linear nature of the game would be a downside. But since this is aiming to be a high-octane action horror adventure, it works really well in the pacing's favor. Yet another RE staple that has taken a backseat are the puzzles. Yeah, they're practically non-existent. They show up from time to time, but most if not all of them are incredibly easy and take minimal effort. I guess the only thing we haven't really discussed yet are the QTEs.
No, God! No, God, please, no! No!
Courier jets, they're not that bad. Resident Evil 4 was the first game that truly utilized QuickTime events in a major way and popularized them before they started showing up in every major 7th generation game, so give it some slack. If you somehow have no idea what QuickTime events are, the moments in a game where you have to press the select button as quickly as possible with little to no warning. I'm sorry, but if you can't stand these, you might not have the best time with RE4. They're not game ruining in any way to me personally, but they are everywhere. Even in certain cutscenes where they would pop up with absolutely no warning. I think QuickTime events can be a good thing to bring tension to a game, especially a horror one, and when utilized successfully, it can keep the players on their toes without negatively impacting the experience. While RE4 certainly does that well in some regards, guys, they are super excessive and can get pretty redundant at times to the point where they lose their effect. But if QTEs piss you off, let me ask you a question. Do you like escort missions? I don't either, but let me introduce you to Ashley Graham. Without going into much detail to RE4's story just yet, the main reason you're here is to rescue this young woman, and that adds a new mechanic to the gameplay where in certain points, you have to protect Ashley from danger. This sounds like hell conceptually, but surprisingly not that bad. For one, Ashley is not an idiot, and she's always behind you and never runs blindly into danger, allowing you to dispatch threats without having to worry about hitting her. Another pro is the fact that she has the same kind of health bar you have, and can be restored to full health with just one green herb. Because of this, Ashley will really die out of nowhere unless clapped by a powerful enemy, and that's if they even attack her at all, since they mostly try to capture her instead, giving you time to react and free her. You can also command Ashley to hang back or hide so you don't have to worry about her. Guys, I'm gonna say it, I love the parts of the game where you're defending Ashley. Sure, they add some extra difficulty, but that's why I love them. They help shake up the gameplay and add some nice variety, all while being fair and not being bullshitty. There's even a segment where you take control of Ashley as she tries to escape a closed area full of enemies she can't fight back against, and it's easily the scariest part of the game and I love it. I think all of that sums up the general gameplay of Resident Evil 4, at least broadly, but guys, I haven't even scratched the surface.
Over here, stranger.
Meet the Merchant. A lot of amazing systems encapsulated by one person. The Merchant is a mystery man you meet early on in the game who's only interested in selling or buying things from you. Throughout RE4, there is a European currency called pesetas you can collect. With pesetas, you can purchase a multitude of items for the Merchant that range from new weapons, extra inventory space, first aid sprays, and maps. Suffice to say, this guy is already a pretty useful mechanic if you want easy access to potentially life-saving resources, but it doesn't end there. You see, if you want even more currency, you can sell the Merchant any items you don't care for. Not only does it free up some much needed inventory space, but it's much more satisfactory than discarding or leaving something behind. There's also the treasure system. In RE4, you are rewarded for any optional exploration not just by resources, but also with treasure that can vary in value depending on how rare it is. Some treasure is even combinable with others that can significantly increase its value. Collecting these treasures, while optional, is pretty integral to keeping a good flow of pesetas that can be used for important purchases. Speaking of which, arguably my favorite part of the Merchant is the ability to upgrade guns. I'm not talking about with simple attachments, though he has those too. No, I mean actually upgrading its individual perks such as fire rate, damage, reload speed, and clip capacity. 2005 by the way. This game was so goddamn ahead of its time. You can upgrade these individual qualities with any weapon of your choosing in any order you want, and it adds so much to the gameplay. Having to decide which weapon upgrade should take priority can lead to a world of a difference. It should also be understood that there is no way you can upgrade every single weapon in one run, but on repeat playthroughs on the same save file, both your upgrades and inventory actually carry over, which gives you a chance to try out all the weapons the game has to offer, as well as give you a reason to play the game more than once. I should also mention that if you upgrade a weapon fully, you get a final exclusive upgrade that turns the weapon into a complete uber weapon. It's awesome. But what weapons will you be using exactly? Well, spoiler alert, Resident Evil 4 has a lot of them. In order to keep this video at a tolerable length, I'm going to have to rapid fire through all of them. The first weapon you start out with, as Resident Evil tradition goes, is a standard handgun that would be your friend at the beginning of your journey, but will soon outlive its usefulness. The second pistol is the Blacktail, which is definitely an upgrade in all aspects, especially fire rate. The third, which you can unlock by shooting 10 hidden medallions around that level for free, is the Punisher. While not as promising as the Blacktail, it's still a viable option if you want to save on pesetas. Though each of these handguns I mentioned you might as well not even waste your time with because of the Red 9. A weapon you can purchase on the second level of the second chapter that is easily the best handgun to use on your first playthrough. It has good range, damage, and clip capacity that all balance out for a hell of a pistol. Going over the shotguns, there's the standard shotgun that's alright for what it is and would be necessary to have as a useful get the fuck off me weapon during the first half of the game. But the second alternative, the Riot shotgun, is a great investment whenever it becomes available since it has significantly greater firepower and capacity, making it the best shotgun in the game. Sadly, the Striker, which is the third available shotgun, I find to be pretty underwhelming. While I had a larger spread, the Riot Shotgun was overall more useful, and you'd likely have sunk in a lot of pesetas towards its upgrades by the time the Striker does become available. There's only one SMG in the game in the form of the TMP, a submachine gun that's perhaps the most versatile weapon in the game. Its incredible fire rate, damage, and click capacity makes it a useful option for hordes and bosses, but can also use it as a substitute for a pistol or even a sniper because of its range and constant ammo drops. I don't know how else to phrase this, the TMP is easily the best gun in the base game, if not damage wise then definitely in terms of sheer usefulness. There are two rifles in the game. The first is the standard rifle, which I didn't really find myself using all that much. It has decent damage and good range as expected from a sniper rifle, but it's pretty slow to use, which can be a huge detriment in a fast-paced game like this, and it takes up inventory space that can be used for much more important items. However, its cooler brother, the rifle semi-auto, is a huge upgrade because of its amazing firepower that rivals that of the Riot shotgun. But if we want to talk about firepower, we best move on to the magnums. That's right, I said magnums as in plural. The first is the Broken Butterfly that absolutely obliterates every single thing in its way. If you've used an RE Magnum before, you should know what you're getting into here. It's an unstoppable killing machine that is only balanced out by its rare ammo drops. Like usual, the main function of this weapon should be saved for more powerful enemies like bosses, but you have the freedom to use it on practically whatever you want. The second Magnum is the Killer 7, which, similar to the Striker, is indeed an unfortunate downgrade. Sure, its handling is better, but not only does it lack the unstoppable damage output of the Broken Butterfly, but there's also no reason to get it since it becomes available after the Broken Butterfly, and unlike it, you can't get the Killer 7 for free. The last two extra weapons I haven't mentioned yet are the explosive ones. First is the Mine Thrower, that's just not it, Chief. Conceptually, it's a cool idea. You fire a mine that attaches itself to an enemy and can blow up others in the surrounding radius. However, ammo for this thing isn't exactly the most common drops in the universe, and even with the exclusive upgrade, its damage leaves a lot to be desired. And lastly, there's the rocket launcher that can be purchased for 30,000 pesetas, and it only contains one shot that cannot be replenished whatsoever. So you're probably thinking, why in the hell would you buy this thing? Well, rocket launcher is not what I'd call this thing. No, I think the correct term is boss skipper, because this thing can literally one-shot any boss because of its incredible damage output. I'm not even kidding, buying this thing might as well be a free boss token, it's hilarious. It of course works for regular enemies as well, but that would sure be an easy way to waste 30,000 pesetas. That about does it for the weapons, but I should also mention that using a knife has also been reworked being a passive option instead of an item in your inventory. Not just that, but it's also extremely easy to use in this game and can play a major role in ammo conservation. Unlike the knife, a new feature altogether is the introduction of grenades. And no, I'm not counting the defensive items seen in RE Remake. These are items you can carry around and throw to clear out or stun enemies. Firstly, there are my favorites, the hand grenades that have a super large damage radius and specializes in blowing things away. Second are flash grenades that are mainly useful to temporarily stun enemies. And lastly are incendiary grenades that have less of a radius but make up for that with good damage. Overall, these grenades are a really nice addition that add even more options to the combat. Yeah, I wasn't exaggerating when I said RE4 had an insane arsenal full of awesome and varied weapons. But then that begs the usual question, what are you going to be using these weapons for? And that, my good friends, leads us to my favorite part of these RE reviews, the enemy types. Resident Evil always has a nice selection of threats that each serve a vital function when it comes to gameplay variety, and RE4 has a shit ton of them, so let's begin. The first and most iconic threat are the village granados. During the development of RE4, Mikami felt that zombies were starting to become a tired trope and wanted to change things up. That's right, as you've probably noticed in the gameplay, Resident Evil 4 is not a zombie game. Instead, the main threats come in the form of granados, infected victims under control by a parasite known as Lost Plagas. I bet it must have been disappointing to a lot of RE fans when they learned RE4 was ditching the main threat of the series. But when you really think about it, Resident Evil's story has always mainly been about biomutated threats, with the zombies simply being the most common of which, so it's not like this decision removed the essence of the series. Also, for the type of game RE4 is, the granados are absolutely perfect. They still maintain zombie-like elements, and it's just as scary seeing someone be a puppet under control of a parasite as it is seeing a shambling corpse. But with increased intelligence, the granados are a lot more capable, being able to wield weapons and raise and climb up ladders. What's really cool, however, is the many ways you can take them out. Since they're human-ish, they can painfully react to certain places you shoot. For example, nailing one in the head will make them stumble back, making them vulnerable for a sick-ass roundhouse kick. Shooting them in the leg can make them kneel down, allowing you to perform a ridiculous yet badass suplex. There's also ways you can turn their weapons against them. If one has dynamite, you can shoot the dynamite or its wielder, forcing it to detonate and take out those in the nearby vicinity. The granados are such an amazing enemy with so many ways you can interact with them in combat, it's awesome. The most iconic form of Ganado that's in another category of his own are the Dr. Salvadors and Bella sisters, chainsaw-wielding maniacs that can kill you in one swoop and can take a hell of a beating. The fear you get when encountering Dr. Salvador for the first time is incredible.
These guys can actually keep up with you.
These enemies are horrifying and serve as a great obstacle to ramp up the horror aspect of the game. Another scary enemy are the bursters. No, that's not their official name, but that's what I call them. Ganados whose head will burst open with a plaga that weaponizes itself to defend their host. The scary thing about these enemies is the fact they show up by chance. You could just be casually blowing the heads off of Ganados until one of them spit out a plaga that you have to deal with immediately. However, these things have a secret weakness: flash grenades. Throwing a flash grenade can insta-kill these fuckers, which gives them another use and makes you have to really think about conserving them more for the right time. You also meet the lovely Carmelos around the same time, infected dogs that are fast and vicious. The main threat these dogs pose is their speed alone, being able to chase you for quite the distance, and they have an attack that can drain around 30% of your health. Plus they just look scary, man. However, they aren't too much of a hassle. Moving forward, we have the Castle Ganados, who are pretty much the same as their village counterparts, except for their weaponry and more creepy appearance. Then there's one of my personal favorites, the Garadors. Tall Ganados covered in armor that have huge blades attached to their arms. Just from appearance alone, they're really cool, and fighting them is even cooler. You see, their eyes are stitched closed, meaning you can completely exploit their hearing in order to hit them in the weak spot behind their back. There are countless ways to do this, which makes facing them so engaging. Then there are the Armadoras, which also look crazy cool visually. They're parasites hiding and controlling suits of armor wielding freaking medieval swords. What more do you want? Unfortunately, you only fight them very briefly, but encountering them for the first time and playing as Ashley is definitely an experience.
You got the serpent ornament. Oh, okay.
There are also the Novistadors, who are interesting to say the least. There's two types of them, the ones that go invisible and the ones that fly. The segment where you find yourself in a sewer crawling with these invisible creatures is a super tense, memorable encounter. Unfortunately, the flying Novistadors are a pain in the ass. They're hard to hit, has an annoying kick that changes the camera and disorientates you, and there is so many of them. Yeah, these guys are the definition of a hit or miss. Our final type of Ganado are the Soldier Ganados. Like the castle ones, not much has changed about them except their appearance and weaponry. Oh, I'm sorry, do those bore you? Because the fucking JJ sure won't. Literal human tanks equipped with miniguns that take the heaviest firepower to take down. They sound annoying at theory, and can be at sometimes, but they're for the most part a really solid enemy. And last but certainly not least are these nightmares, the Regenerators. Byproducts of Lost Plague God's experiments that, as the name implies, can regenerate any wound. These seemingly invincible monsters will stalk you around tight halls and corridors and can stretch their flexible limbs as if they were elastical to grab you from range. Dealing with these monsters are terrifying, but luckily they're not unkillable. By getting a thermoscope on your rifle, you can locate and destroy the plague out on the creature's bodies, making them explode. These monsters are such a cool addition and are definitely the highlight of the horror Resident Evil 4 has to bring. That wraps it up for normal enemy types, but remember, we still have boss fights. The first big bad you encounter is Del Lago, a giant salamander that probably has the most unique fight in the series as it drags you around in a wooden boat by your anchor, and you're tasked with defeating it with some good old harpoons, all while dodging both it and the obstacles in the river. It's a pretty cool fight that has some pretty tense moments, and I can only imagine how it would be for Delassophobes. However, it can be a little tricky to get used to at first since it's kind of difficult to control your boat, but it's still a cool fight. Next is El Gigante. You encounter these things multiple times throughout the game, technically making them more of a sub-boss, but I count them as actual boss fights simply due to how big their encounters are in scale. I mean, look at this thing. It's a literal giant creature capable of kicking your ass like a soccer ball. You mainly just have to damage it until it exposes its obvious weak spot that you can either shoot or run up to and hack away at with your knife. Fighting these guys are intense and very fast paced, but I found that the handy dandy TMP can obliterate them in one clip with the right upgrades. Still a formidable boss that's always fun to defeat. After all, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. The third big fight is with Priest Mendez, one of the game's many central antagonists. This fight has two phases after Mendez's gnarly mutation. The first one is simple enough since Mendez is pretty slow and his weak spot is obvious enough. Afterwards though, he'll split away from his legs and traverse around the barn at quick speeds of his arms, adding some nice verticality to the fight. Still, for the most part, Mendez is a piece of cake, but this boss is a nice climactic way to end the big cheese. And what is probably the scariest sequence in the game is the fight with Vertigo. Ronan Salazar's right-hand man, or Xenomorph meets Predator Man, that will at first chase you around from the shadows before revealing itself and pursuing you up close and personal. It cannot be damaged by conventional means, but it can be frozen by nearby canisters, making it vulnerable. Or alternatively, you can try dodging its attacks for 4 minutes until the elevator arrives. Either way, it's a neat setup for an adrenaline-rushing enemy. After that is Ronan Salazar himself, who mutates him and his other bodyguard into this giant abomination. The guard part of the creature is the main threat, capable of whacking you around or even insta-killing you for a devastating bite. Once you damage his eye enough, Salazar will reveal himself, allowing you to deal in some damage. I really like this fight. It's not the most unique boss in the game, but it's fun, and that's all that matters. After that is a U3, and I mean, just look at this thing. That's what I call a fucked up abomination if I've ever seen one. Anyways, phase 1 of this fight is ironically my favorite part about it, since you're trapped in a tight and closed space of this thing as you desperately try to find your way to the next area. It's hectic as hell and heart pumping. The second phase is your standard shoot him until he's dead approach, and while less exciting, it's not bad in the slightest. Immediately right after that is Jack Krauser, whose first phase is also way better than his second. You start out in a maze-like battle arena that you have to make your way through as Krauser follows closely behind, coming at you with a variety of melee attacks and even using his SMG to try and spray you down. They even hide behind corners and ambush you when you think you've lost them. Avoiding this guy is so much fun, but once phase 2 begins, it's time to actually confront the man in a close quarters fight. This sounds amazing at first, until you realize you can kill him in like 6 knife slashes. Kind of a bummer, but the first phase more than makes up for it. And lastly, we have Lord Sadler as the final boss. While many think this fight is anticlimactic, I personally like it. In Sadler's rad mutated form, there are multiple eyes that you can shoot, which will make Sadler vulnerable for attack. It's simple and not all that nuanced, but the cool attacks Sadler has as well as the rainy scenery and epic music makes this a decent final confrontation. That concludes RE4's bosses, and I don't think you need to tell me that these fights blow every boss we've seen in RE up to this point out of the water. Each of them excel on scale and creativity and are amongst the game's many highlights. But with the new action-focused gameplay, can Resident Evil 4 still maintain the amazing environments the previous games are remembered for? Come on, you already know the answer to that question. Despite the game's great length, there are 3 main environments in total, with each of them being ginormous in size. The first is the village, which might be the most popular of the areas since it's the one you start out in. It's a super remote, mundane village that does a great job of making you feel isolated in this rural part of Spain, even more so in the rainy nighttime portion of the game. The interesting terrain also makes it pretty memorable too. The second main area is the castle, which is definitely my favorite. I mean, how could it not be? It's a medieval castle. The giant complex building with creepy and larger-than-life decorations and maze-like designs calls back to the series' roots and feels great to explore it. And finally there's the island, which is definitely the least exciting of the 3 areas of its mundane, lackluster scenery, but does make up for that with super memorable sections like the Regenerators, U3 and Krauser fight, Mike, and the climax of course. And if it's not obvious enough, each of these environments have a great level of detail that is unreal for a Nintendo GameCube 2005 game. Yeah, the environments are great. This game just can't resist getting perfect marks. And it continues that trend when it comes to pacing. Even with the amazing visuals, flawless combat, unique and varied arsenal and enemy types, this is definitely the most impressive part of the game to me. Guys, no matter where you are in this game, there is always something happening. It never in the slightest fails to keep you hooked. You go from battling an endless wave of villagers to battling a giant salamander to battling a literal giant to protect Ashley to fighting Mendez and so on and so on. This is especially true during the island portion since crazy shit is happening so consecutively. The U3 and Krauser fight literally share the same level. And if you're wondering what I mean by levels, the game is split into 5 chapters, with each one usually spanning across 3 or 4 individual levels. And yes, in case you're wondering, this game is long, with your first playthrough likely to come in at around 20 hours. The linearity of the experience makes it not as easy to speedrun as the past games, however with infinite weapons, I was able to finish it in a little over 3.5 hours. It is rare for a 20-hour game to have pacing this good, and with a current price tag of $20, you are certainly getting your money's worth, especially since this game has its fair share of reasons for replayability. What I mean by that is this game has an absurd amount of cool unlockables, from costumes to additional modes to bonus weapons, you name it. By just completing the game once on any difficulty, you will unlock a handful of things. One is a new available handgun, the Matilda, which makes a glorious return since its debut in RE2. As you may expect, it is an absolute beast that can even one-shot enemies when upgraded enough. A even cooler reward is the one and only returning infinite rocket launcher. You have to buy it from the merchant for a hefty price of 1 million pesetas on New Game Plus, but once you obtain it, it can one-shot every enemy in the game, which is sick. You also unlock an extra difficulty setting, Professional Mode, along with 3 additional game modes, Mercenaries, Separate Ways, and Assignment Ada. All 4 I'll talk about individually in just a bit that all have their own unlockables as well. For now, we'll just be talking about the base game and what it has to offer. At some point in the game, you'll see a door appear beside the merchant that leads to a shooting gallery minigame where you have to be as accurate as possible and hit as many targets as you can for points. This minigame is a pretty funny addition that allows you to really soak in how good the aiming is in RE4, at least if you were playing in 2005. Don't get me wrong, the game has great aiming, but it is a little stiff for modern controls, which did make this shooting minigame more frustrating at times than it was probably intended to be. However, these minigames do give you a pretty cute reward. You get a lot of pesetas as well as, and hear me out, bottle caps of in-game characters and enemies. Not only that, but they each come with select sounds as well.
Don't worry, Ashley. I'm coming for you.
Leon, help!
Did you send out those invitations? I told you no more than 50 people.
Leon, now!
This is such a stupid reward that is definitely not worth the effort it takes to get, but I can't help but smile at these bottle caps instead of wonderfully goofy inclusion. Plus, getting the complete set feels satisfying as all hell. You can also get access to new costumes for Leon and Ada after completing the game once. Leon has on an updated version of his RPD outfit from the second game, which is a sick callback, and Ada has on combat gear that somehow makes her even look cooler than before. But how about we dive deeper into RE4's additional content, starting with professional difficulty. I should say beforehand that Resident Evil 4 isn't really that difficult, especially on easy. And while professional isn't as hard as I thought it would be, it definitely wasn't a walk in the park either. There are tiny changes like enemies not dropping ammo as frequently, regenerators having an extra plaga, and a tactical vest being unavailable for purchase. While these things aren't crippling, the main difficulty comes from how buff the enemies are in terms of both health and damage. It is now super easy to die after like 2 hits, and in an action game where you're going to be damaged quite frequently due to the constant combat, yeah, good luck. If you want a harder way to play RE4, Professional does its job, but man was it annoying. You see, I like it when super hard difficulties transform the game entirely, forcing you to play in a different way and get creative. Instead, all Professional did was just shine a bright spotlight on all the bullshit damage you take that would otherwise be brushed aside in a normal playthrough. It doesn't change the experience, it's the exact same game, except a lot more tedious since it feels like this difficulty was more of a last minute addition and wasn't in mind for the developers when designing the main game. Also, who the fuck decided to make QTEs twice as fast on Professional? They were already annoying on normal, but my god are they horrible here since you only have a split second to react to them. And apparently there's some sort of bug in the HD re-releases that has something to do with the frame rate, which makes QTEs much stricter. Because of this, sections where you have to run away from boulders or especially the giant Salazar robot are nearly unplayable. I went back and counted, and it took me, guys, brace yourselves, 61 attempts to outrun the robot Salazar, because no matter how furiously I mashed that square button, I would die over and over and over again. By the time I finally got it, you would have thought I was trying to break my controller of how fast I was mashing the action button. So yeah, Professional difficulty is not for me. But the reward you get from it is more than worth the trouble. The PRL-42, a laser weapon that can auto-target everything in the surrounding area when charged and insta-kill everything in your way. You really don't need any further elaboration, you're invincible with it. Another additional mode that's returning from RE3 is Mercenaries. A combat-focused mode where you're placed in 1 of 4 maps and tasked with gaining as much points as you can. You do this by ranking up kills and collecting time bonuses to keep your timer going so you can keep earning points. By the end, you're graded out of 5 stars by how well you did, judging from how many total points you collected. There's a reason Mercenaries is arguably the series' most iconic bonus mode. The amount of fun replay value Mercenary adds is great, and you can find yourself lost for hours trying to top your previous score in this super addictive mode. You may be wondering how it doesn't at all get repetitive, and that's because of different maps as well as unlockable playable characters. Starting with maps, you have 4 overall, with the first being the main part of the village taken straight from the base game, which works perfectly for this type of mode. The special enemies here are the Bella Sisters, which while a tad terrifying, can be super easy to deal with given how open the environment is. Second is an area from the castle that is undoubtedly the easiest with its open playing space and a special enemy type being the Garradors, which like I mentioned earlier, are easy to maneuver around because of their lack of sight. Third is the island, which I personally wasn't a fan of. Not only is it confusing to navigate around, but the special enemies are JJs who can melt your health with the minigun from across the map. And the fourth and final one is a second island map that has a water aesthetic. I actually really like this one because of its scenery and unique design. Unfortunately, it's not ideal to play on if you want a good score because of its added difficulty that comes in the form of Dr. Salvador that is twice as fast as his normal speed. Fuck the regenerators, this is the scariest thing in the game. The first character you start out with is our boy Leon, who has the worst arsenal out of any of the characters, only being equipped with a normal handgun and shotgun. Unlike Ada Wong, who's actually showed up prepared with a Punisher, semi-auto rifle, and TMP. After that is Jack Krause from the story, where things start getting crazy. He only has a combat knife and bow and arrow to his name, but what he lacks in weaponry, he makes up for in raw power, having some sick melee abilities and being able to use his mutated arm as a formidable weapon. The fourth is fan favorite Hunk. He's a character that requires unique handling since his arsenal only consists of a TMP, but he has an insta-kill melee attack after the enemy has been stunned. Because of this, Hunk is honestly really fun to play since he's not outright broken but has a cool advantage of his melee. And lastly, there's my boy Albert Wesker. Unlike the knife-only Code Veronica battle game, this game actually makes you feel like a maniacal superhuman, with his super powerful melee attacks and his decent weaponry that includes a handgun with critical damage, the rifle semi-auto, and the Killer 7 Magnum. You don't unlock these characters off the bat, but they're reasonably easy to get since the only requirement is a 4-star ranking on certain maps. By getting 5 stars with every character on every map, you'll unlock the hand cannon Magnum that you can use in the base game. I never got it, but it's reasonable to assume it kicks ass. Yeah, Mercenaries is a super solid inclusion because of its replayability and fun varied characters and maps. However, Assignment Ada, another additional game mode, doesn't quite reach the level of quality and replayability Mercenaries does. You spawn in the island section from the base game as Ada with a set loadout. Your goal is to run around and collect 5 lost Plague samples from Wesker and then evacuate. This mode is unfortunately not that interesting. While the island is definitely a location that works as a place to explore, the mode never utilizes that to its advantage since the placement of Plaga is basically a straight shot to the island, so there's no exploring here. I can't even say the mode presents a challenge since while it does feature island ganados and has a super action heavy direction, the mode is full of checkpoints so you can't really fail at it. Not to mention you complete your objective rather quickly and that quick fight with Kraz at the end is... yeah, it's pretty lame. You also aren't getting more powerful as you go along since you can only pick up more ammo and grenades and no new weaponry. And there's not even a timer that can encourage you to go back and beat your score. This mode was a neat idea and it's always great playing as Ada, but this is definitely the laziest content the game has to offer. Even though it'll be interesting to play on your first time and you unlock the Chicago typewriter for the separate raise mode, a Tommy gun that literally shoots bullets the equivalent of shotgun shells. No, I'm not making this up. We already know the game excels in every way possible gameplay-wise, but there's still a very essential element I've yet to go over, and that's the story. Don't think I've forgotten about it. The plot of RE4 follows Leon S. Kennedy, 6 years after the Raccoon City incident, now a private special agent for the government. He's tasked with rescuing the president's daughter, Ashley, who's gone missing in a rural part of Spain. But soon after arriving, Leon learns that Ashley is being held captive by an evil religious cult named the Los Illuminados, that are taking control of the village's residents with a parasite named Los Plagas. From there, the story becomes an ever-evolving adventure as Leon tries desperately to escort Ashley out of here, all while familiar faces resurface and a world-ending plot is unveiled. Right off the bat, I gotta say I love the premise. It still keeps the series tradition of escaping a dangerous environment as you learn more about its history, but this time, the stakes are much larger than the lives of our protagonists, which made me much more invested. My only issue is how big of a jump this game makes from what was being set up in the previous entries. In RE1, 2, 3, and Code Veronica, the Umbrella Corporation reigned as the series' baddies, and the previous 3 canon games was really hyping up finally taking these guys out.
Hey, it's up to us to take out Umbrella.
That's it. I've had it. This time they've been too fun.
Yeah, it's payback time. We've got to destroy Umbrella. Now, let's finish this once and for all.
That's why when you finally get to RE4, this being the first thing you hear in the game is super disappointing.
With the whole affair gone public, the United States government issued an indefinite suspension of business decree to Umbrella. Soon its stock prices crashed, and for all intents and purposes, Umbrella was finished.
Wait, so Umbrella going bankrupt in between games is really how they get defeated? Are you serious? Thankfully, in Umbrella Chronicles, a 2007 spin-off rail shooter for the Wii, you get a scenario that follows Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine as they break into the last Umbrella facility and put an end to the corporation in a more climactic fashion. But let's be honest, how many people played Umbrella Chronicles? And those who did still had to wait 2 years of this being the only explanation they get to Umbrella's downfall. This sets a bad precedent for the rest of RE4's narrative, but the Los Illuminados and the mystery surrounding the Lost Plagas parasite is actually a pretty engaging story, amplified by its memorable characters. We start out with Leon S. Kennedy, who has undergone massive growth between games. When we last saw him, he was just an inexperienced, naive rookie who was just level-headed enough to hold his own. But just like his RE3 epilogue sets up, he was trained to become a special agent afterwards, and that experience is displayed in his calm grasp on the situation, excellent combat skills, and one-liners. Constant supply of one-liners.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
I've been expecting you, my brethren.
No thanks, bro.
I've sent my right hand to dispose of you.
Your right hand comes off?
Say whatever you please. Die, you worm!
I don't know how else to say this, so I'll just say it. This is the best we've seen of an RE protagonist, period. Not only is Leon super comedic and badass, but his huge want to help people as much as possible comes out in his interactions with the other side characters. Next is Ashley Graham, the person you're tasked with saving. Yeah, this one character might be the most memed in the RE fandom other than Steve. And that's not of any fault of her own, but because when she gets put in danger during gameplay, you'll hear the obnoxious Because of this, and being somewhat of a nuisance for many, there are countless online parodies that have reinforced the general sentiment that Ashley is intolerable. Trust me, I find these parodies hilarious, but Ashley definitely isn't that bad of a character in reality. Sure, she's nothing more than a damsel and doesn't do much, but what can you expect from someone who is this young who's been put in such a dangerous situation? And she definitely has her moments and even helps you at certain points in the game. She's also voiced by Carolyn Lawrence, who does a good job, and funny enough is the voice of Sandy Cheeks from SpongeBob. Another of Leon's few allies throughout the game is Ada Wong, who is not only back but is seemingly working for Wesker. Ada here is even more enjoyable than before, who like Leon, demonstrates an astonishing level of skill and experience as well as a laid-back jocular personality. In the main game, her motives are a mystery, but in separate ways, which is an additional story mode following Ada's perspective, we find out her role here is to retrieve a Plaga symbol for the organization, a new corporation rising in power. One reason I love Ada is because of her grey morals, since she more than often are working for the baddies. And that's the case here and I love it. Also, she's portrayed here by Sally Cahill, who once again reprises her role from RE2. Sally adds a whole nother level of quality to the character and has massively upped her game this time around, likely due to the higher standards of voice work in games around this era. By the way, I should mention that Separate Ways, while not spectacular, is a decent side mode that does a good job in explaining what the hell Ada was up to, and there's some cool moments such as facing Sadler in his human form, and playing as Ada is always a good time. Beating Separate Ways unlocks the Chicago typewriter for the main game, as well as a second set of costumes for Leon and Ashley that are just amazing. Leon appears in a fancy suit with a switchblade instead of his normal knife, and will make the Chicago typewriter look like more of a conventional Tommy gun with special reload animations. What's even cooler is when Ashley appears in a medieval suit of armor that I at first thought was purely for comedic purposes. That was until I realized they made her completely invincible to all attacks. This realization was had during my professional run, and I cannot even begin to tell you how helpful it was. Sorry for going off track there, but the next character is Luis Serra, who my friends have appropriately nicknamed the Sexy Spaniard. Luis doesn't actually have much screen time, but when he does show up, he is super enjoyable. He's a very likable comic relief who has a great dynamic with Leon and helps you at multiple points. However, there is much more to him than meets the eye, since it's revealed that he was the core researcher behind the Lost Plagas and inadvertently gave the Los Illuminados cult a dangerous weapon that he desperately wants to see taken away from them. He's a man who wants to rectify his mistakes, which makes it sadder when he meets his sudden death at the hands of Lord Sadler. In my opinion, I think he was cut off too soon, but he made a huge impression at the time he did have. Luis is voiced by Reno Romano, who does a fantastic job. The last two minor protagonists are Hunnigan, who's your no-nonsense advisor, and Mike, your backup support who is clearly having the time of his life taking out Granados before he becomes another life Sadler has taken. Now that we've gotten our heroes out of the way, what about the villains? Well, RE4 breaks Code Veronica's record of 3 villains with an impressive 4. 5 if you count Wesker. The first of many is Priest Mendez, aka
The Big Cheese. What?
Voiced by Jesse Corti. Not much is known about this guy, but he's basically just one of Lord Sadler's cronies who's the main supervisor of the village. He doesn't have much of a character, but that's intentional since he mainly just serves as an intimidating force. A polar opposite to Ronan Salazar, voiced by Renny Mujica. My personal favorite villain in the game, and perhaps one of the best villains in the series. Salazar is the definition of a joke villain. This short, whiny, senior-looking youngster steals every scene he's in, being super arrogant and overconfident in his abilities. I mean, this guy has a giant robot statue of himself. But the more Leon progresses, the more Salazar gets more and more frustrated and throws tantrums like a toddler, and it's amazing.
Where's the satisfying sound of one's impalement?
Don't fall for this old trick.
How dare you! No more games! Kill him! Kill! Quickly! We shall prepare for the ritual!
Also, this back and forth between Leon and Salazar really sticks with me because of how fucking stupid it is.
Oh, what a touching moment we have here.
All spoiled thanks to your interruption. Why don't you do us all a favor and leave before the audience gets pissed off?
You're nothing but an extra in my script, so don't get too carried away. Your biggest scene is over.
I don't ever remember being a part of your crappy script.
Well then, why don't you show me what a first-class script is like through your own actions?
I know Resident Evil dialogue is cheesy, but what the fuck is this conversation? After he is dealt with, the next side antagonist is Jack Krauser, voiced by Jim Ward, who you may recognize as Captain Quark from the Ratchet & Clank games. Being an old partner of Leon, Krauser is the only villain who has a personal connection with him, and was actually the one who captured Ashley in the first place. He's basically a double agent, pretending to be serving Lord Sadler, but is actually working for Wesker since he was promised viral power, and demonstrates later in the game in a pretty badass moment.
Witness the power!
What I love so much about Krauser is he's essentially an evil version of Leon, willing to drop all of his morals and betray his peers and country just for his own self-gain. While Salazar is still my favorite villain in the game, Krauser is a close second. And finally we have Osmond Sadler, who leaves a lot to be desired. Voiced by Michael Goh, basically, this guy is the leader of the Lost Illuminados who's manipulated Salazar into giving him the necessary funds to research and dig up the Lost Plagueis parasite that was then used to control all of the villagers as hive mind servants. Ashley was captured to demand ransom from the United States and was implanted with the parasite in hopes she would attack her father, the president, when she returned. There's also another plan that would involve people of high political importance in the government being controlled by the parasite and secretly controlling the country until the Lost Illuminados would rule it and eventually the rest of the world. While this is not a bad plan by any means, Lord Sadler himself isn't all that memorable. He's pretty cliche, not nuanced in any way, and he's just not interesting. Even though his appearances are minor, I do have to bring up Albert Wesker, who's once again portrayed by Richard Waugh, who sounds phenomenal in the role. Wesker serves as Ada's supervisor, and while he doesn't do much in the story, what the game sets up is interesting. It turns out the organization is planning on betraying Wesker, which is no matter for him since he's planning on reviving Umbrella from the ashes. This is honestly a cool setup for a future sequel and further cements Wesker as the true villain of the series. Overall, the story and characters are great. With a cool setup, memorable characters, and great pacing, RE4's narrative offerings live up to its gameplay ones. In conclusion, Resident Evil 4 is easily one of the best games ever made. Even if you don't like it, though I have no idea why that may be the case, its story and characters are great, the gameplay here is phenomenal, revolutionary, and infinitely replayable, and RE4 not only set the stage for many games after its release, but is a masterpiece that changed everything, including the very series we're going to permanently alter forever.